Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to tackle something that might just turn your whole idea of decision-making upside down. Ready for this? It's the idea that the predictions we make can actually shape those outcomes, like some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher for sure. It all comes down to how we humans love to use mental models, to simplify the world around us. It's like we crave order and control, so we build these little mini realities in our minds.
So are you saying these mental models, they're like our own personal cheat codes for navigating this crazy, complex world we live in?
Exactly. But here's the catch. The trap snaps shut, so to speak, when we forget that those models are just that, representations. They're not reality itself. And get this, our actions based on those models can actually change the whole game entirely.
Okay, now you've got to give me a real-world example of this model meltdown. How does this play out in real life?
All right, picture this. A company thinks, hey, let's flood the market with cheaper versions of our product. Domination, right. They're working with that mental model that says lower price equals more buyers. Simple.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, that seems pretty logical. What's the problem with that?
Well, sure, they might see a little jump in sales initially, but in the long run, they risk, well, cheapening their brand. Suddenly, they're not associated with that high-end, exclusive feel anymore.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. Like those luxury fashion houses, the ones that try to go mainstream, they kind of face this, don't they?
They do. It's like they win the battle but end up losing the war. Their strategy backfires because they didn't think about the long-term effects.
So they're playing checkers while everyone else is playing chess, huh? They didn't see the bigger picture.
Bingo. It's what we call interactive failure. The model's success triggers changes that end up undermining it. It's almost like a self-destruct button hidden within the success itself.
Okay, so does that mean, like, all models are inherently flawed? Are we just chasing our tails forever?
Not necessarily. The real issue is that we lean on our models so heavily that we forget they're just simplified versions of reality. Even the most complex, super sophisticated models have their limits. Remember, even Newton's laws of motion, right? They don't apply at the quantum level.
Okay, so no model is perfect. Got it. But can you give me some examples of these limitations that, hit a little closer to home for the average person?
Sure, think about those economic models that often assume people make rational decisions. But then, boom, a financial panic hits, and suddenly emotions take over. Fear. Right. And those carefully crafted models, they just fall apart because they didn't factor in the human element.
Yeah, so it's like those models are operating in this perfect little bubble while the real world, well, it's messy and unpredictable.
Exactly, and this applies to political forecasting too. The traditional models depend heavily on past voting patterns, but they can be totally blindsided by something unexpected, like, say, a global pandemic or some new tech that totally reshapes the political scene.
It's like trying to use an old, outdated map to navigate a constantly changing maze.
And let's not forget about public health. Models trying to predict how a disease spreads rely on the assumption that people will behave consistently. But as we've seen, recently, how people follow health guidelines, it can change drastically based on new information and public sentiment.
It seems like the common thread here is that we're dealing with systems that are in constant flux, always evolving, yet we're trying to slap on a sense of static order with our models.
You've hit the nail on the head. And get this, what's even more fascinating is that our actions within those systems, well, they can actually speed up those changes, creating a sort of feedback loop. This loop can either boost our success or magnify our failures.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Can you break down that feedback loop idea a bit more? How do our actions end up changing the very systems we're trying to model?
Okay, think about Black Friday sales, the classic example. The initial model was simple, slash prices to attract shoppers. You get a huge spike in sales. It worked like a charm. But over time, consumers got used to those deep discounts. They came to expect them.
So the very act of discounting so heavily, it actually changed how consumers behaved.
Bingo! Shoppers started holding back on purchases, waiting for the next big sale, knowing that the retailers would eventually cave and offer those irresistible deals. What was once, a guaranteed sales frenzy turned into this constant bargain hunt.
It's like the retailers accidentally taught their customers to wait for the lowest price possible. And it's not just Black Friday anymore, right? The discounting madness spread to the entire holiday season and even beyond.
Right, and it's not just about consumers and sales tactics either. Think about the pressure salespeople put on potential buyers. Sure, those aggressive tactics might work in the short term, But they also create distrust.
Oh, I've totally been there. Nothing makes me want to run away faster than a pushy salesperson.
Exactly. And over time, buyers develop this resistance to those tactics, and entire industries can get a reputation for being, shady or manipulative.
So it's like a boomerang, right? The very actions designed to boost sales end up undermining trust and maybe even leading to more regulation.
You could say that. And this phenomenon, it's not just in the business world. We see it play out in all kinds of systems, from those social media algorithms we talked about to the way traffic flows in cities.
Okay, so tell me more about those social media algorithms and traffic patterns. How does this static model trap thing show up there?
All right, let's take social media first. In the beginning, those platforms, they were all about getting people to engage, keeping them glued to their screens. More engagement meant more eyeballs for advertisers. Seems like a smart move, right?
Yeah, but we've all seen how that's turned out. What happened when engagement became the only goal? What were those unintended consequences?
Well, the thing is, those algorithms weren't built to tell the difference between good engagement and, well, bad engagement. So they ended up favoring content that really riled people up, stuff that triggered those strong emotional responses. Often those were negative emotions like outrage and anger.
Right, because the more divisive the content, the more people interacted with it. It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And so in their quest for engagement, these platforms, they accidentally created these echo chambers and filter bubbles, right? And those just amplified polarization and misinformation.
Yeah, and as people started to realize how they were being manipulated, they began to lose trust in these platforms. Now those same companies are scrambling to fix their algorithms, trying to figure out how to promote those healthier online interactions without losing that engagement.
A classic example of the static model trap in action, wouldn't you say?
It is, it is. It was kind of ironic, isn't it? They were
Yeah.
so focused on keeping people hooked that they ended up pushing them away.
It is. It is. And, we see a similar thing happening when cities try to fix traffic jams by building more highways. The thinking is more roads equals less traffic, right?
Yeah, and I think we all know where this is going. People see those new wide open lanes and it's like, hey, perfect time for a road trip.
Right. The very solution meant to ease congestion ends up attracting more drivers, which often leads to, well, the same traffic jams or even worse ones.
So we end up right back where we started, stuck in traffic. Except now there's more concrete and less green space.
You got it. And the unintended consequences, well, they can be pretty significant. It's like we're always trying to play catch up, outsmarting these systems. But those systems, they're changing right along with us.
Okay, so clinging to those static models in a dynamic world, it can lead to some pretty bad outcomes. But how do we break free from this trap? Is there a way to move from this reactive mindset to a more proactive one?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The good news is there are things we can do to become more dynamic in our thinking. One of the most important skills is learning to always question our assumptions.
So don't just accept the models we're given or the assumptions we've inherited. We've got to dig deeper and ask, hey, what are these models based on? And is that foundation still solid in today's world?
That's it. For example, a marketing strategy based on, the idea of a captive audience, well, that might completely bomb in a world of personalized content feeds and endless distractions.
Right. It's like trying to get someone's attention in a noisy, crowded room by just shouting louder. Need a whole new approach. But how do we even begin to shift our thinking like this? Seems pretty daunting.
It can feel overwhelming at first, but it's really about developing a mindset of curiosity and open-mindedness. Instead of just focusing on the results we want, we need to pay more attention to how our actions are impacting the whole system, like a gardener, tending to a delicate ecosystem.
I like that analogy. So instead of trying to force things to grow according to our plan, we need to pay attention to those subtle feedback loops and adjust our approach as we go.
Exactly. We have to become more skilled at spotting those feedback loops and anticipating those unintended consequences. For instance, if your marketing messages are getting more and more aggressive, are your customers pushing back? Are they starting to tune you out, or even worse, feeling manipulated?
So it's about paying attention to the signals the system is sending back to us and being willing to course correct before we do more harm than good.
You got it. And instead of holding on to those static models, we need to embrace the idea of adaptive models. Think of it like a self-learning algorithm, constantly updating its approach based on new data.
That sounds incredibly complex. But what if we're not all coding geniuses? Are there simpler ways to incorporate this adaptive thinking into our strategies?
Of course. Even just taking a fresh look at your strategy regularly can help you spot potential blind spots and make adjustments. You could bring in people from different departments or get some outside perspectives to challenge those assumptions.
So it's about taking a step back from the canvas, so to speak, to see the bigger picture, instead of getting lost in the details.
Another important strategy is to diversify your mental models. Instead of looking at a problem through just one lens, try looking at it from different angles: economics, psychology, history, sociology. Each one offers unique insights that can help you develop a more well-rounded understanding.
It's like putting together a team of experts with different specialties, all working together to solve a complex problem.
Right. And maybe the most important piece of advice I can give is to stay humble. Remember that even the smartest model is still just a model. The world is full of surprises, and clinging too tightly to our predictions can make us miss those unexpected turns.
So it's about acknowledging the limits of our models and being willing to adapt when they inevitably fall short.
Absolutely. It's about embracing uncertainty and recognizing that the most valuable skill in a world that's always changing is adaptability.
You mentioned paradigm shifts earlier. Could you expand on that a bit? How do we know when it's time to just ditch the old model and embrace a whole new way of thinking?
A paradigm shift, it happens when a model fails so spectacularly that we can't just tweak it a little. We need to rethink the whole framework. Think about the 2008 financial crisis. Those fancy mathematical models they used to assess risk in mortgage-backed securities, they seemed to be working perfectly until suddenly they didn't.
That was a real wake-up call for the entire financial system, wasn't it?
It was. It exposed some fundamental flaws in how they were assessing risk and led to a complete overhaul of financial regulations.
It's like the ground shifted beneath everyone's feet, and they were left scrambling to find their footing in a totally new world.
Right. And while those moments of upheaval can be unsettling, they also offer opportunities for innovation and growth. Think about all the scientific revolutions throughout history. Each one started because people realized the old model just wasn't cutting it anymore. It couldn't explain what they were seeing.
So it's about recognizing those moments when the old ways of thinking aren't working anymore and being willing to embrace a new paradigm, even if it means challenging our deeply held beliefs and assumptions.
And those moments often come when we encounter something totally unexpected, something our current models just can't explain.
So how can we get better at anticipating these paradigm shifts?
Yeah.
Is there a way to see the warning signs before things get out of control?
Now that's where things get really interesting. What if we could create a model for how models themselves fail? I know it sounds kind of paradoxical, but it's actually a powerful way to understand our own thinking processes on a deeper level.
A model for how models fail. Whoa. That's
Yeah.
that's like meta on another level. It's like we're stepping outside of our own brains and looking in.
It is. It is. It's all about developing this meta awareness of how our minds work, you know. If we can understand how models break down, then we can start to, well, anticipate those potential pitfalls and adjust our thinking before things go completely off the rails.
All right, you got me hooked. Break down this meta model for me. How can it help us avoid these model meltdowns?
So we can kind of categorize model failures into four main types. The first one, it's called parametric failure. It's basically where the underlying structure of the model is okay, it's sound, but some of the specific values or variables, they need a little tweaking. It's like imagine you're following a baking recipe, right?
Yeah.
And you realize it needs a bit more flour or sugar to get that perfect consistency.
Okay, I can definitely relate to that. So it's not about tossing the whole recipe out, just adjusting some of the ingredients. What other kinds of model failure do we need to watch out for?
All right, next up, we've got structural failure. This one's a bit more serious. It's where the whole architecture of the model, it's just flawed and it needs a total redesign. Imagine you're building a house and you realize, oh no, the blueprint has some major errors, the kind that can make the whole structure unstable.
Yikes. Yeah, that's a bit more concerning than a slightly off-tookie recipe. How do we know when we need to, like, call in the engineers for our mental models?
Well, usually you'll see a structural failure when the model just keeps giving you inaccurate or unreliable results, no matter how much you try to tweak those parameters. It's a sign that the fundamental assumptions of the model, they're just not holding up anymore.
So we're not just adjusting the knobs and dials here. We're talking about recognizing when the whole machine needs a makeover. What about those other two types of model failure?
Okay, we've also got contextual failure. This is where the environment around the model, it's changed so drastically that the model, even if it's internally consistent, just doesn't apply anymore. It's like using a map of ancient Rome to try to find your way around New York City today.
Yeah, that's not going to work out too well. The landmarks are totally different, the streets have probably changed, and the whole layout, well, it could be unrecognizable. It's like trying to navigate a new world with an old, outdated map. So, what's the last type?
The final one is interactive failure, which we touched on earlier. This is where the model's own success, it ends up triggering these adaptations that eventually, well, undermine it. Like that Black Friday example, remember? The retailer's discounting strategy, it worked so well that it trained shoppers to only buy things when there were huge discounts.
Right, so the model created the conditions for its own downfall. It's a bit like a snake eating its own tail.
Exactly. And here's the key takeaway. By understanding these four ways that models can fail, we can get better at spotting those warning signs, those red flags, and adapt our models before things spin out of control.
It's like having a diagnostic tool for our mental models, something to help us troubleshoot those potential problems before they turn into huge disasters.
Exactly. It's about shifting from a reactive mindset to a proactive one, cultivating that awareness of how our minds work when we make decisions.
Wow. This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. We've
Yeah.
explored so much today, from how attractive yet dangerous mental models can be to those strategies for breaking free from the static model trap and embracing a more dynamic way of thinking.
Yeah, we've seen how our predictions can actually shape the very outcomes we're trying to predict, and that can lead to some unintended consequences that range from, just plain frustrating to downright catastrophic.
But the good news is, we've also learned that by understanding how those models fail, by looking at things from different perspectives, and by always questioning those assumptions we make, we can get better at navigating a world that's constantly changing and becoming more and more complex.
It all comes down to recognizing that our models, they're tools. And just like any tool, they can be used effectively or, well, not so effectively. The key is to become like master craftspeople of our own thinking. We need to be constantly sharpening our skills and adapting to this ever-changing landscape of knowledge and experience.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a question to ponder.
What mental model do you rely on the most in your life? And could that model be influencing your decisions in ways you haven't even thought about? Maybe it's time to take a step back, look at that model with a fresh perspective, and really embrace the power of dynamic thinking. Keep exploring, stay curious, and never stop learning.
Until next time, fellow deep divers.